Personally, I'm a big fan of synth-based music, especially when it's used in the composition of films. They can bring in all sorts of different feelings and tones and can really draw in the atmosphere. Of course, orchestras are also great and other instruments, but there's just something so unique and special about the synthesizer. For the past few years, I've been noticing that a few films here and there will have a very retro sound to it, where it's synth-based, and the riffs and the sounds of it are very reminiscent of earlier scores of the 70s and 80s. I first started to see this with the Nicholas Refn movie Drive, which the score was done by Cliff Martinez. It's a soundtrack that I overall heavily recommend with a very 80s feel. Refn's follow-up film, Only God Forgives, also had a score done by Cliff Martinez, and once again, a very synth-based and dark score. Even though I don't like Only God Forgives as much as I love Drive, I still recommend the score heavily if you're into it. Another recent example would be You're Next, which is a film that got a recent wide release, and I noticed that the score once again had a very 80s and late 70s feel to it with the score. Even though the movie had some issues, I overall enjoyed the film. I thought it was pretty fun, but what I really liked about it was the score. Unfortunately, the soundtrack for that hasn't been released. However, in my opinion, of all the movies I've seen recently that kind of give a nostalgic synth vibe to it, the movie that takes the cake is the remake of Maniac. This remake came out in 2012, but it didn't get a wide release until last year in 2013. It's a remake of the controversial 1980 slasher film of the same name, and it does some things differently, although there is overall a similar storyline with a similar lead villain, who's our main character in fact. It has one big difference from the original in that it literally shows us the first-person perspective of the killer, who's played by Elijah Wood. Now, some people don't like this. You could also argue that it's not that different from a found footage perspective, but all in all, I think it's actually a really creepy film. Yeah, the first-person gimmick can be a little tiring at times, but overall, I think Elijah's performance and the direction and the script end up making the movie worth watching, and it's ultimately a pretty scary film in my opinion. But the one thing I really loved about this movie, despite its flaws, is the amazing soundtrack. It's done by a French musician who I haven't heard of before called Rob, R-O-B. Hopefully I won't butcher his name, but his real name is Robin Couture. And I haven't heard too much of this guy's work outside of Maniac, but I'm actually looking forward to checking it out. The whole score is synth-based, and it's dark and creepy, and it feels like an endless nightmare, which is totally fitting for the film since we're seeing a first-person's perspective of a psychopath. It just fits the disturbing psychological tone of the film. Whether you like the movie or not, I think the music blends in perfectly with it. One thing I really like about this is that while a lot of the songs are really creepy and well done horror music, some of the songs are really good for casual listening if you're into dark synth music. When the movie was over, the one thing I just couldn't stop thinking of was how much I loved the score for this film, and the soundtrack overall. I recommend both the original Maniac and this recent remake, although I would warn you that if you're not into the whole first-person gimmick, then you might want to stay away from the remake because it can be tiring if you're not buying it. But with all of that said, if you're really into synth music, I heavily recommend this score. It's really creepy and unique, and it's a fun listen. Check it out.